Welcome. I am Marie Asher, the Lillian Hedrick Huber Endowed Director of the Health Sciences Library. And it is my honor to thank you and welcome you to our Yom Hashoah Symposium commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg Doctors Trial. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping comments. I'd like to remind everyone present in the auditorium to silence their phones and devices. Number two, I'd like to let those attending via Zoom to be aware that closed captioning is available for the event and can be turned on using the live transcript option on your Zoom toolbar. And three, continuing education credits are available for this program, and the information is currently on the screen. Those who plan to claim credits would be wise to open the site now by either pointing your phone at the QR code on the screen or going to the URL listed and using the code 07TORI. And I'll show this again at the end of the program. So many thanks to the small army of folks who were involved in putting this event together and assuring its successful execution. Particular credit to Dr. Edward Halperin, Chancellor and CEO of NYMC, who had the idea for the event and gathered a small group of students to help in coordination, most of whom we'll hear from today. Additionally, I'd like to thank Joseph Popek and the Popek family for their support of biomedical ethics education after the Holocaust. And if you would wish to philanthropically support programs like these, feel free to reach out to Mr. Gerald Volk in the development office here at NYMC. So lastly, thank you to our co-sponsor, the Center for Medicine After the Holocaust, and their president, Dr. Sheldon Rubenfeld, also clinical professor of medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Here is Dr. Rubenfeld via video. He has no conflicts of interest to report.
I want to thank the New York Medical College and Dr. Halperin for inviting me to participate in this important symposium on the 75th anniversary of the conclusion of the Nuremberg Doctors Trial, and to tell you a bit about the Center for Medicine After the Holocaust, or CMATH. The Nuremberg Doctors Trial is a watershed event in medical ethics. But I would like to take this opportunity to honor an unsung hero of the trial, Dr. John Thompson, without whom there would not have been a trial. Dr. Thompson was a squadron leader in the Royal Canadian Air Force and a specialist in aviation medicine who was sent to Germany to document the achievements of medical research, which were thought to be substantial. He concluded, however, that 90% of German wartime research was criminal. He coined the term medical war crimes and insisted that the perpetrators of these crimes be prosecuted, lest it appear that the Allies condoned this type of human subjects research. He ultimately succeeded in having a medical trial, but he had to overcome numerous and very large political and administrative obstacles. For example, the United States was caught between procuring and prosecuting Nazi medical scientists, such as the well-known Wernher von Braun, the father of American space travel, and the less well-known Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who was the father of both German and American space medicine. He was very active here in NASA in Texas until his previous association with the medical experiments at Dachau came to light. Dr. Thompson also had to overcome the resistance of the German medical profession, who did everything it could to obscure and cover up its eager participation and vital role in these medical war crimes. The United States also was not anxious to defend its own eugenic policies, such as the world's first involuntary sterilization laws that were the model for Germany's sterilization law that led to the involuntary sterilization of 400,000 German citizens, or America's Jim Crow laws that were the model for Germany's racist Nuremberg laws. or its own human subject research, which was in some ways similar to that performed by Nazi bioscientists. Now, this information about John Thompson is just a very small sample of what I did not know when I first visited Auschwitz in 1998 and thought to myself, why was a man with both a medical degree and a PhD needed on the train ramps at Auschwitz to select patients for the gas chamber? To answer that question, I began studying, lecturing, and writing about medicine and the Holocaust, and in 2010, founded the Center for Medicine After the Holocaust, whose mission is to challenge doctors, nurses, and bioscientists to personally confront the medical ethics of the Holocaust and apply that knowledge to contemporary practice and research. And CMATH, the Center for Medicine After the Holocaust, accomplishes its mission by first identifying champions who study, research, lecture, and write about medicine and the Holocaust. They can be physicians, nurses, bioethicists, lawyers, historians, or clergy. Dr. Halperin is such a champion, and we appreciate all the work he's done with CMATH. We also convene conferences on such topics as human subject research, physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, or bioethics after the Holocaust. At our very first conference, three of the 30 speakers were Nobel laureates, and we had other distinguished scientists, bioethicists, and physicians such as Edmund Pellegrino, Leon Cass, Arthur Kaplan, and Francis Collins, the retiring head of the National Institutes of Health. We maintain a library of these lectures from most of these conferences that we have convened. We've also developed curricula and syllabi for use in medical schools, nursing schools, and universities. We've convened international conferences on medicine after the Holocaust, such as the Second International Scholars Workshop on Medicine After the Holocaust, which was held in Israel. Some of these conferences have led to publications such as Medicine After the Holocaust, From the Master Race to the Human Genome and Beyond, Human Subjects Research After the Holocaust, and most recently, Physician-Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia Before, During, and After the Holocaust. And perhaps our most important event has been these transformative educational trips that we take to European medical sites relevant to the Holocaust. We bring interested medical personnel to places such as Hadamar and Bernburg, two psychiatric hospitals each with a gas chamber and crematoria in their basements that serve as euthanasia centers. We visit death camps such as Auschwitz and Majdanek, hospitals like the former Karl Bonhoeffer Nerven Clinic, from which patients were selected for compulsory sterilization and involuntary euthanasia. We visited the Wannsee Conference Memorial and Education Center, the site of the conference on the final solution of the Jewish question. And we also visit sites of medical experimentation, such as the Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum. Once again, I'd like to express my gratitude to New York Medical College and Dr. Halperin for the opportunity to participate in this important symposium and to tell you a bit about our Center for Medicine After the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rubenfeld, who we really can't thank enough. Now I would like to introduce Ms. Ann Bajewski, Director of the Touro Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, to light the memorial candle. She will be joined in the auditorium by Chief of Staff Vilma Bordenero. And after they light the candles, I invite others who'd like to light a candle to please step forward and do so.
Who am I to speak of a time of families crushed, of crimes of mankind, of children hiding and living in fear, of mothers trying to hide all their tears, of fathers praying to an empty heaven, of people dying again and again. Who am I to know what it was like to be persecuted by day and trapped by night, to be surrounded by a world turned upside down, to be starved and tortured and beaten to the ground, to witness a nation of hate marching past, to see all their dreams broken and shattered like glass? Who am I to mention their suffering and pain, the ghettos, the camps, life and death inhumane? I wasn't even born, I wasn't even there. It happened long ago, it could never happen here. Who am I to know what God had in mind when the virtues of man were buried alive, when good lost to evil and hope turned to despair, when hell upon earth seemed everywhere? But who am I to let their memories be forgotten, to say and do nothing as if it never happened, to forsake the loss of our Jewish family, to live in a world of complacency? And so we light this yellow candle to rekindle God's flame, to shine his light upon the world once again, to sanctify the memories of the millions of souls, to honor their prayers and all their lost goals. We bless their existence by being alive, to light this yellow candle as proof we survived.
If anyone else would like to step forward and light a candle, I invite you to do so. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Margot Laurie, a second-year medical student here at New York Medical College.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I will be sharing with you a brief overview of the Doctors Trial, also known as USA versus Karl Brandt et al. I will talk briefly about some of the historical context and then discuss the trial and its outcomes. Some of the underpinnings of the Nazi euthanasia program and pseudoscience experiments come from the eugenics movement, which predated Nazi Germany. The concept of cleansing or purifying the German race was not something that Hitler invented. The first eugenics congress was held in 1912 in London, and the second and third took place here in New York in 1921 and 1932, respectively. The concept of eugenics was not limited to Germany. From 1909 until 1979, the state of California used eugenics laws to involuntarily sterilize thousands of people in state hospitals and institutions. In the wake of World War I and heavy casualties and economic devastation, the idea of a person being, quote, valuable versus, quote, unproductive became a central concept in the attempt to, quote, purify the German race, and were furthered by the Nazi regime. Some historical context of Nazi Germany. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th of 1933. Dachau concentration camp was established March 22nd, 1933. In April, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses, the exclusion of Jews from civil service, and caps instituted on Jewish students in public education. In July 1933, the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases Law was passed. 9 conditions with presumed genetic origins were listed in the law: hereditary feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, severe physical deformity, and chronic alcoholism, end quote. Individuals given one of these diagnoses would be forcibly sterilized. Ultimately, 400,000 Germans were involuntarily sterilized. In 1935, the Nuremberg race laws were passed, which included the marital hygiene law. The eugenic theories became a basis for discrimination, laws, sterilization, and ultimately murder. The image on this slide shows a portion of one of the Nuremberg race laws documents. The first trial at Nuremberg, and likely the most well-known, is the International Military Tribunal, held in 1945. The tribunal prosecuted 24 defendants, of whom 19 were convicted and 12 were sentenced to death. There are 12 additional trials that followed the International Military Tribunal, the first of which is the Doctors Trial. The Doctors Trial at Nuremberg began on 9 December 1946. Before discussing the trial, I want to note that doctors joined the Nazi Party in greater percentage and faster than any other profession. 4 American judges presided at the trial: Walter B. Beals, chief presiding judge, along with Johnson Crawford, Harold Sebring, and Victor Swearingen. The following is a direct quotation from the opening statement by Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who's shown on this slide. The defendants in this dock are charged with murder, but this is no mere murder trial. We cannot rest content when we have shown that crimes were committed and that certain persons committed them. To kill, to maim, and to torture is criminal under all modern systems of law. These defendants did not kill in hot blood, nor for personal enrichment. Some of them may be sadists who killed and tortured for sport, but they are not all perverts. They are not ignorant men. Most of them are trained physicians, and some of them are distinguished scientists. Yet these defendants, all of whom were fully able to comprehend the nature of their acts, and most of whom were exceptionally qualified to form a moral and professional judgment in this respect, are responsible for wholesale murder and unspeakably cruel tortures, end quote. While the trial began in December, the indictment was filed in October of 1946. The charges included conspiracy to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in criminal organization. The defendants included 20 doctors and 3 administrative officers. Specified in the war crimes indictment were high-altitude experiments in which victims were subject to low-pressure chambers, freezing experiments in which victims were forced to remain in a tank of iced water or kept outdoors naked for many hours, malaria experiments in which victims were intentionally infected with malaria so that various drugs could be tested, mustard gas experiments in which wounds were deliberately inflicted on the subjects and infected with mustard gas, sulfanilamide experiments in which wounds were deliberately inflicted on the subjects and then were infected with bacteria. The infection was aggravated by forcing wood shavings and ground glass into the wounds. The infection was treated with sulfanilamide and other drugs to determine their effectiveness. Bone, muscle, nerve regeneration, and bone transplantation experiments. Seawater experiments in which victims were deprived of all food and given only chemically processed seawater. Epidemic jaundice experiments in which victims were intentionally infected with jaundice. Sterilization experiments, spotted fever experiments, experimentation with poison, incendiary bomb explosion experiments designed to test pharmaceutical preparations on phosphorus burns. The creation of a skeleton collection for the Reich University of Strasbourg. The murder of Polish nationals who were alleged to be infected with incurable tuberculosis, and the euthanasia program, which, quote, involved the systematic and secret execution of aged, insane, incurably ill, of deformed children and other persons by gas, lethal injections, and diverse other means in nursing homes, hospitals, and asylums. Such persons were regarded as, quote, useless eaters and a burden to the German war machine, end quote. It is estimated that 250,000 people were murdered in the euthanasia program. Hundreds of thousands died in more than 70 scientific experiments, including political prisoners of war, homosexuals, Catholic priests, Poles, Roma, and Jews. On this slide on the left is a photo of Maria Kuzmierczuk, who was subjected to the sulfanilamide experiments. This photo was taken inside the Ravensbrück concentration camp as the woman wanted to document the crimes perpetrated against them. She survived and testified at the trial. On the right, survivor Jadwiga Zido testifies in Nuremberg. Overall, the trial included 85 witness testimonies and over 1,500 documents comprising well over 10,000 pages. The verdict of the trial was announced on August 20th, 1947. 16 were found guilty, 7 were sentenced to death, and 7 were acquitted. What we know today is the Nuremberg Code was written by Drs. Andrew Ivy and Dr. Leo Alexander, and was part of the judgment delivered by Judge Walter Beals at the close of trial. The code is comprised of 10 principles and outlines the rights and protections for human subjects in medical research, including the principle of informed consent. These principles center the concept of do no harm and continue to be the foundation for international medical ethics. For references and additional reading, please scan the QR code on the screen. Thank you for being here today and being part of this program.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Calvello, and I'm a medical student here at New York Medical College. I am here to introduce Professor George Anas, who will be our next presenter. Professor Anas is a distinguished professor at Boston University's School of Public Health, where he also serves as director for the Center of Health Law, Ethics, and Human Rights. He has appointments in the School of Law and School of Medicine as well, and has authored or edited over 20 books, including co-authorship of the book, The Nazi Doctors and the Nuremberg Trial. Professor Anas has no conflicts of interest to declare today. Please help me in welcoming Professor George Anas.
I want to begin by thanking Margot Lurie, because it's our two talks are kind of like part one and part two, so it's going to work out very well. Next slide. This, of course, is the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg. It was one of the few buildings that was still not totally destroyed by the Allied bombings, and it was in the American zone, and for all those reasons, it was picked as the site of the Nuremberg trials. Next slide. As we already heard, the first trial, it was the International Military Tribunal by the 4 Allied powers who tried what were called then the major Nazi war criminals for crimes against humanity and war crimes. It was after this trial, very famous trial, next slide, that we had another articulation of what is now known as the Nuremberg Principles. Arguably, they were law before the Nuremberg trials, but after, there was no question that there are such things as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Individuals can be held responsible for committing them, and obeying orders is no defense. Next slide. And we saw these gentlemen in black and white. These are the gentlemen in color from the first subsequent trial, all run by the Americans, but Telford Taylor argues, and I think persuasively, that when we talk about Nuremberg today, we talk about all 13 trials, the 12 subsequent trials and the big trial, and everything that came after Nuremberg that relied on it. So Nuremberg has become, I think, a symbol that grows every year. Next slide. And here's, we see Telford Taylor. Again, we've seen him before, and he's with Karl Brandt, the lead defendant, if you will, in the doctor's trial, trial number 1. Next slide. And this is the defense. This is the prosecution table. I'm sorry, Telford Taylor with his team. You can see they're mostly civilians now, even though this is still a military tribunal, but they are, and mostly white guys from the United States. The gentleman in the bottom there, Mr. Ferenz, is the only survivor of the prosecution team at Nuremberg. And he still spends much of his time arguing that we should have, and many people agree with him, a permanent Nuremberg, and that we really need an international criminal trial that's available to try war criminals all around the world at any time. And we'll get back to that at the end of the presentation. Next slide. This is an example. Margot gave us a list of about 20 different experiments, and that was terrific. And it's hard to encompass and believe. I mean, most of these weren't real experiments. They were just sadistic tortures. But the two most famous ones, if you want to use the word famous, are the freezing experiments, which kept coming up over and over again in both the big trial and in the doctor's trial, and the high altitude experiments. Theoretically, each experiment had a wartime rationale, trying to see what temperature flyers and sailors could survive in the ocean, and trying to see at what height flyers could bail out of their planes. But none of this actually ever mattered and was ever applied. These were just, I think as Telford Taylor rightly says, these were just different ways to kill people. And mostly what the Nazis were experimenting on concentration camp victims, mostly Jews, was how to kill people more efficiently and faster. And the rationale is in the upper left-hand corner there, the right-hand corner as you face it, that the Jews were infecting the Aryans. They were killing them. They were making them sick. And the only way to cure the Aryans was to kill the Jews. Next slide. And as was noted already, what came out of that trial was something we know now, and we knew almost right after that, as the Nuremberg Code, which required consent prior to any experimentation. And the consent under Nuremberg was drastic, if you will, was uncompromising. It had to be informed, voluntary, competent, and understanding. And even while after the subject agreed to be part of the experiment, obviously consent had nothing to do with the Nazis and nothing to do with concentration camps. But the judges were looking forward and argued that even after you got consent in the future from research subjects, you had the right to withdraw at any time. Okay, so those are the two big, what are known as the rights parts of Nuremberg: consent and changing your mind. And then there are 8 welfare provisions as well, that you needed a qualified researcher, a valid study based on animal work. I'm sorry, and an important question. Professor Wiesel was kind enough to write the preface to a book my colleague, Michael Groden, and I wrote back in 1992, The Nazi Doctors and the Nuremberg Code. And what Professor Wiesel said, I think is quite telling. He said, for the Nazis, human beings were not human beings in their eyes. They were abstractions. This is the legacy of the Nuremberg Tribunal and the Nuremberg Code. The respect for human rights and human experimentation demands that we see every person as unique, as an end in themselves. And I don't know if that answers the question. How is it possible, as Professor Wiesel continued to ask for his whole life, how is it possible that educated people could do this? We don't know that educated people are any less evil than uneducated people, but a fair question, Professor Wiesel, fair question. Next slide, please. And one of my favorite, this is that anyone who wants to know anything about the psychology of the Nazi doctors should obviously read Professor Lifton's book. But for me, and I think for him in a way, one of the interesting parts of doing that research was he had to get informed consent from these people before he could talk to them. You know, in some senses, how outrageous is that? In another sense, as I think Dr. Lifton thinks as well, it's just right that everybody deserves the dignity of informed consent. And that's what the Nuremberg Code requires. Next slide. Professor Jay Katz the leading authority on human experimentation and on the Nuremberg Code, I believe. He died a few years ago, but he wrote the basic book on experimentation with human beings in 1972. That's just amazing. Almost everything else was written in the 1990s. And to his death, Jay kept making the point, and it seems right to me, that we are very conflicted about research even now. That to the most part, patients look at the researcher as their doctor, that they're there to help you, not to use you for their own purposes. They believe the researcher really is their personal physician, and they believe they really are a patient. It's not true. Jay Katz was a psychiatrist, eminent psychiatrist, showed all kinds of reasons why you wouldn't want to believe this and why you would let your imagination in this sense overcome your knowledge and your good sense, because you want to be cured. And in some senses, the doctor wants to cure you too. But the researcher, cure is secondary, if at all. The issue is research, and you're following a protocol to gain generalizable knowledge. You're not treating a person according to the Hippocratic ethic to try to first at least do no harm and to try to do good. Okay, it's a different thing. And what Professor Katz used to say is that doctors gain authority through silence, which is one reason historically there has always been a silent world of doctor and patient, the title of another one of his books, and that it's very, very hard to deal with it. In my conversations with him, we argued that the patient actually wants silence too. The patient doesn't want uncertainty. Obviously, that's what the patient's going to get. The patient wants to be cured. And so this is a problem. This is a big problem, and it remains a problem in the doctor-patient relationship. The Nuremberg Code didn't change that. The Nuremberg Code just pointed out where the problem was, and part of our job to try to move forward from there. Next slide. So the Nuremberg legacy, if you wanted to talk about that just for a second, I would say mostly it's on the left side of the screen. You know, the civil regulations, as the Nuremberg Code, of course, the Declaration of Helsinki, which is actually a doctor's code for doctors, but nonetheless taken almost specifically from the provisions of the Nuremberg Code and added to the U.S. federal research regulations. And in Europe, they're ahead of us in Europe, the Convention of Human Rights and Biomedicine. As I said before, Nuremberg experimentation was part of the bigger trial and the bigger issue, which was war crimes and crimes against humanity. And here we see the research regs now become part of the Geneva Conventions, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Convention Against Torture, and the movement, which I mentioned, hopefully toward a permanent Nuremberg, now in the guise of the International Criminal Court. Next slide. So, how'd the U.S. do with war crimes and crimes against humanity? In the middle turned out to be closer to the end, but in the middle of the Vietnam War, we learned about the massacre at My Lai and the attempts of the U.S. military to try to bring the troops to some kind of justice. It was not easy, and arguably it was not done well. Next slide. For our purposes, the important thing is that Telfer Taylor, the same person who prosecuted at Nuremberg, was monitoring all of this going on, and it really literally made him sick. He wrote a book about it, Nuremberg and Vietnam, and tried to understand Elie Wiesel's question too. How is it possible? How can this happen? How do we wind up slaughtering women and children and old men in a village that has no arms and is no threat to you? And all General Taylor could say in the end, I'll commend his book to you, all he could say in the end was that we treated these persons like abstractions, like Wiesel said, and he said, quote, it's the last line of the book, somehow we failed ourselves to learn the lessons we undertook to teach at Nuremberg. And that failure is today's American tragedy. He actually wrote this book before he wrote his history of the Nuremberg trials, the anatomy of the Nuremberg trials. Well, he was right. What can we say? We didn't learn the lesson. Next slide. And I think, with no great psychological insight, just the insight of someone who studied a lot of these proceedings, is that the dehumanization that seems to be consistent in most commentators' view of how we can start to kill people is we have to make them subspecies, make them animals, make them not human. And we've done that ourselves. We have to would say as Americans, we've been in a number of wars now, not doing very well with them, but we have managed to dehumanize the enemy and in some senses act in a way that's revolting to the average American. Next slide. This is General, this is the chief prosecutor, Justice Jackson at Nuremberg. And he made the point a number of times and tried to make it over and over again, that it is our duty to apply the same rules that we applied to the Nazis to ourselves. And he put it, he had a great way with words. He put it this way. He said, if we pass these defendants, he's talking about the Nazis now, a poisoned chalice, we put it to our own lips. And that was the point also that, unfortunately, General Taylor was making during the Vietnam War, that we did not learn basic war crimes, basic crimes against humanity, or at least we couldn't help ourselves to commit them ourselves. And ultimately, Taylor believed, and we can talk about what we believe, that until we're ready to actually stop wars, we're not going to be able to have a permanent Nuremberg tribunal. We're not going to be able to actually try people for war crimes in any kind of a world where it makes any sense. Next slide. I don't have to tell you what this is. I mean, you're all, unfortunately, we're all watching the war in the Ukraine and children, women, children, maternity hospital in this slide being, I'll say, what certainly looks like being purposely targeted for killing, which is clearly a war crime. There, next slide. And this is Prime Minister Zelensky appearing in front of the United Nations, in front of the Security Council, and making an argument that Russia should be kicked out of the Security Council and should be tried for war crimes. And what does he want to try them for war crimes? Well, we're not surprised at this conference. He wants a Nuremberg type tribunal to try the Russians for war crimes. And he is absolutely right that that's the only type of tribunal that could try the Russians for war crimes. But we don't have it. It doesn't exist. The tribunals all have veto power on the part of the Security Council. And that, because primarily the United States, but also because of China and Russia, not just the United States. There is no authoritative international tribunal like Nuremberg. We have, I believe, an opportunity now to change our minds. President Clinton, remember, signed the document for the International Criminal Court. President Bush unsigned it after he became president. We should sign it again, and we should move quickly to get it ratified in the Senate and give the International Criminal Court enough authority to actually try to stop an ongoing war with ongoing war crimes, something we see every day that we want to watch television. I think a lot of us would like to stop, but it's not going to stop the killing. We really, really do need a mechanism, an international court with authority to at least have a chance to try war criminals and hold them responsible. Next slide. I want to end with President Kennedy's very famous speech right after the Bay of Pigs, and right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the Bay of Pigs too, when the world came as close to nuclear annihilation as it's ever come. It was a terrible time. Kennedy could have said, "The hell with the Russians. There are mortal enemies, we have to kill them." He did say there are mortal enemies, but he said that was wrong. What he says is that, yes, of course, we shouldn't be blind to our differences, but we should pay more special attention to our similarities. And he said in his famous words, "We all inhabit this same planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal." The point he made is when we treat people as different, we wind up killing them. When we concentrate on their similarities, we're all members of the same human species, and we're much more likely to live together. Next slide. And this is just my colleague, Michael Groden, and me on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code in Nuremberg. But I want to just give a shout out to Michael and thank him for the 40 years that he and I have spent together thinking and talking about Nuremberg and what it means. Thanks, Michael, and thank you all.
Good afternoon. My name is Arsha Venkat. I'm a second-year medical student here at New York Medical College, and I will be introducing Professor Barrett. Professor John Q. Barrett is the Cardozo Professor of Law at St. John's University in New York City, a graduate of Georgetown and Harvard. He is also the director of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, as well as the writer of the Jackson List blog. He has no conflicts of interest. It is my honor to introduce to you Professor John Q. Barrett.
Thank you very much, Ms. Venkat and Dr. Halperin, Rabbi Krupka, Professor Asher, everyone who's been part of this invitation and these arrangements, and in general, New York Medical College and Touro University. Obviously, this is a day of memory and of teaching, but it's not a one-day annual event. It's a day that reminds us of an ongoing permanent responsibility. And so it's really an honor to be working on that together with each of you. I think perhaps this is going to be a little out of order because I was asked to lecture about Justice Jackson and the big trial, the first trial, as a ramp into the Nuremberg Doctors Trial. But I think if you sort of hear me take what I'm going to present and then stir it up with what Professor Anas just presented and what Margot Lurie presented, it will add up to exactly where we're supposed to be. So I will share my screen. Am I authorized to share my screen? There we go. And here we are. I do have no conflicts. This is the famous slightly aerial view from one of the camera ports view of the defendant's dock at Nuremberg. The path that got us here, and Robert Jackson is the leading architect of what got us here, which is the first proceeding that begins to consider doctors' crimes, is my general topic. Of course, it begins here in a sense. This is Hitler and a military parade in Nuremberg at one of the party rallies, which occurred every September until the fall of 1939 when the active aggressive war began. This is a Nuremberg party rally at the Zeppelin field at the parade ground, not much more than a mile from the Nuremberg Palace of Justice courthouse, where about a decade later, the accountability process began. This chart illustrates the Nuremberg laws, the racist eugenic madness that were promulgated by a rump Reichstag, but really a rubber stamp declaration by the Führer at the 1935 Nuremberg Party Rally. And these categories of defining people as inferior, as non-citizens, as unfit for professions, including the medical profession, among many others, pushing towards emigration, dispossessing of property, causing incredible, obviously, suffering, confining many as enemies of the Reich in concentration camps without due process, is the internal German process that then becomes the euthanasia program and so many other horrors before the shooting war begins. This is September of 1939. This is the start of the invasion of Poland, which in less than a month had rolled it up, much like perhaps was expected in Ukraine beginning in this winter. This is a couple of years later during occupation in Warsaw. These are Jews, these are beautiful, innocent lives. These are Holocaust victims. The particulars of what happened to these children and this mother is unknown, but in general, we of course know an enormous amount. And the source that deserves credit for that is the Nuremberg trial process. To get there, let me introduce Robert Jackson. He was born in this farmhouse late in the 19th century in northwestern Pennsylvania. This is Spring Creek Township in Warren County, just south of the New York state line. It's a farm valley. It's much like a rural farm location one might find in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Germany or Ukraine or across the United States. Harmless, innocent, hardworking individuals. Those were Jackson's forebears, and that's where he started. His father moved the family into New York State. He went to a small town high school, Frewsburg, New York. He graduated in 1909, and then mostly by apprenticeship rather than going to college, he became a lawyer by the time he was 21. And in 20 years of private practice from 1913 to 1933, he put on a little weight. He fleshed out with a fair amount of prosperity. He became a leading lawyer in Western New York State, across New York State, in the New York Court of Appeals, in bar association circles nationwide. And he had a very diverse practice. He was a trial lawyer. He was an appellate lawyer. He was a policy lawyer. He was a corporate advisor and board member. He did civil and criminal litigation. He had a general practice, if I may say that to doctors, of the type that lawyers definitely do not do these days. He also was a Western New York Democrat by heredity and not particularly active during the years where his private practice star is rising. But by the late 1920s, a Democrat who he'd met a decade earlier is sort of assembling political supporters across the state because he's running for governor. And that's Franklin Roosevelt, who of course wins in 1928, gets reelected in 1930, and gets elected president in 1932. That relationship, which is an acquaintance and a political partnership, becomes a friendship and is of course the nominating engine for most of Jackson's incredible rise in public life, beginning in 1934. In a 6-year period, Roosevelt nominated Jackson and the Senate confirmed him to 6 different offices. And so from 1934, when he goes to Washington as general counsel of the Bureau of Internal Revenue in the Treasury Department, and then moving over to the Justice Department, heading the tax division, heading the antitrust division, being Solicitor General of the United States for 2 years, our principal advocate in the Supreme Court, then Attorney General of the United States for 18 months, 1940 and 1941 until the summer, which is war preparatory and aiding Great Britain work, and then appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court in the summer of 1941. Jackson is a meteoric star. This is a glimpse of Jackson, Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, another New Deal official on a fishing trip off the coast of Florida. They dressed well when they went fishing in the 1930s. This is one of many photos from the covers of national news magazines as Jackson is litigating and winning the cases of the moment that are the real Klieg-like cases. He prosecuted Andrew W. Mellon, former Treasury Secretary, for civil tax fraud and had a big win. Here he's defending the constitutionality of a big New Deal law, the Public Utility Holding Company Act. This is Jackson burning the midnight oil as Solicitor General. And this is the court that he begins to argue to, still the Hughes Court, the Brandeis and Cardozo Court of the 1930s when Jackson is Solicitor General. This is Jackson as Attorney General and another in the AG's conference room. He was a meteor in domestic political life. And if things had taken a couple of different turns, we might well never have seen Jackson as a Supreme Court justice. We might instead have seen him in the White House, because Roosevelt was planning to retire after 2 terms. And of course, many would have been contenders, but the sort of New Deal fair-haired boy was Robert Jackson. Of course, world events and 1940 mean Roosevelt seeks and wins a 3rd term. The next year is when he puts Jackson on the Supreme Court. This is the signing of that commission in July of 1941, and that's Jackson in his robes. He's on the court just 5 months when Pearl Harbor is attacked and when Hitler declares war on the United States. And he tells Roosevelt, I'm in an irrelevant backwater here on the Supreme Court. You can find somebody else to be a justice. There must be something that I can do to contribute more to our country at war. And Roosevelt kind of all but pats him on the head and says, I intend to make you Chief Justice, and you're a lawman. This is a war and you're not much of a military man. So sort of stay put and become a justice. There may, however, be things that you are uniquely suited to do after the war. And of course, that's just a kernel of a thought. It extrapolates too much to say Roosevelt is envisioning Nuremberg, but he's envisioning something that is a law project, which is a Robert Jackson project down the road after the war is won. And so in the meantime, Jackson is on this court. In the 4 years before Nuremberg, 41 to 45, he shows the incredible power of his pen, the beauty of his words. He writes some incredible landmarks, the flag salute case, West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, which was about the rights of conscience of Jehovah's Witness schoolgirls. He's a dissenter in the Japanese American exclusion case, Korematsu, many others. In the meantime, the war is being fought, and by 1943, although much hard fighting is ahead, the war will be won by the Allies. And so this is the Moscow Conference in November of 1943. The US Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, the Russian Foreign Minister, Molotov in the middle with the pen in his hand, the British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. And among their Allied commitments here in 1943 is that we together will hold the Nazi perpetrators of this war accountable after they are defeated. Now, this is in the Nuremberg courtroom. This is one of the decor pieces from long before the Nuremberg trials, the 10 Commandments over the door. This is the path that takes Jackson from the Supreme Court to this courtroom. It begins with this man, because by the time the war is won, it's late April of 1945. Roosevelt has died 2 weeks earlier. Harry Truman has inherited this awesome desk and raft of responsibilities and this Allied commitment. Hitler's about to be captured. The Germans are about to be defeated and unconditionally surrender. That's our terms. And Truman reaches for America's leading legal figure, Justice Robert Jackson on the Supreme Court. He asked Jackson to be U.S. Chief of Counsel, the U.S. Chief Legal Representative on this project, in part so that the Russians and the British will contribute something of similar stature. And Jackson says yes. He kind of has a little bit of a wry look in this May 2, 1945 publicity photo. He had no idea really what he was signing up for because it was all smoke. Hitler soon was dead, as was Himmler, as was Goebbels, as was much of the inner circle. There was no Allied agreement or plan of how to do this in detail. There was no assembled body of evidence. So for the first phase of this job, Jackson has to do diplomacy. This is London in the summer of 1945, a four-sided table. The British are facing us. Jackson and colleagues are on the right. The French are on the left. The Russians have their backs to the camera. And generally, this is a showdown and an impasse between the Russian desire for a show trial and the Anglo-American commitment to due process. So maybe we're not going to be able to do this with the Russians. This is what had become of Germany. It unconditionally surrendered. It no longer existed. It was Allied occupied in these sectors. The blue sector is the American sector of occupation. Munich is in the center and Nuremberg is about 100 kilometers north of Munich. Jackson is told by the army to do it in our turf where we can secure it. He's told there is a surviving facility in Nuremberg that can accommodate. And so while London is still at impasse, he invites all the Allies to come, but the Russians decline. So it's British, French, and American to come see Nuremberg. They find this, which is a city in rubble. But down the road, the Furtstrasse that connects Nuremberg to Fürth, they see this Palace of Justice, which is the courthouse building in the front, and Wheel and Spoke is the prison complex in the back. It's got a couple of missing sections, but that can be repaired. In the meantime, the Russians decide to stay in the alliance and to do it our way. And so back in London in August, they signed this agreement that creates the International Military Tribunal, the world's first international criminal court. An important thing to see is that although its jurisdiction encompasses what we would regard as human rights crimes, its focus was the war. Its jurisdiction is conspiracy planning, the waging of aggressive war, the commission of war crimes, and the commission of crimes against humanity. But those trailing concepts, in their view, are dimensions of the horror of war. The supreme international crime, the point of Nuremberg, as they are doing it, is not what we would call the Holocaust or crimes against humanity or individual human suffering. It is the Germans twice in 30 years having thrown the continent into World War. And the second time in violation of all the post-World War I treaty commitments that had made war illegal. And so they go to Nuremberg. This shows a blown out part of the roof that got fixed. This shows the annex building with its roof fixed and its army vehicles in front of it. The four windows on what we would call the third floor are courtroom 600, the site of the IMT trial, and a year and some months later, the doctors' trial. This is an aerial view of that courtroom, the prosecutors' tables, the defense attorneys in front of us, the defendants behind them, across the support and the judges. This is the standing and Jackson you see at the corner of the American prosecution table as the judges first take the bench. These are the judges. They functioned as a court of 8, 2 from each nation, and they did this proceeding in public on evidence, much of it documentary. These are frontal views of the judges. The chief American judge is former Attorney General Francis Biddle. This is Jackson opening the trial, November 21, 1945, his opening address. Canvasses the evidence. The evidence will show these defendants have committed these crimes. And it includes mentions of horrific experimentations on innocent people, prisoners in occupied nations. These are the defendants who represent the leading sectors of Nazi power and perpetration. Hermann Goering is in the front corner. He's the Reichsmarshal, Hitler's number 2, Rudolf Hess, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, General Keitel, and on down the line. There is not a defendant in this trial who is a senior medical official. There are occupying, imprisonment, concentration camp, extermination camp bureaucrats, but not somebody with a medical degree. And so part of what unfolds in this trial is the war and its crimes, the particular consequences and dimensions that become the trial program that follows. For example, this fellow testifies as a government witness, Dieter Wisliceny. He worked for Adolf Eichmann in the Jewish office in Berlin, reporting directly to Himmler, reporting directly to Hitler. So it is a short chain of command. And what they supervised was the extermination of Europe's Jews. Now, of course, that included slave labor and sorting and medical experimentation. Wisliceny is a planner and a perpetrator who testified to all of that. This is Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who's a defendant, who is part of the Gestapo SS occupation torture regime that includes medical experimentation. This is Rudolf Höss, who testifies as a witness when he's captured in the spring of 1946. He's the former commandant of Auschwitz, and he testifies about the extermination that he had supervised and the labor and the adjoining factories where the enslaved human beings worked, and experimentation that was done there, including by Mengele. The Nuremberg trial closes by the summer of 1946. It is a record, 42 volumes of trial transcripts. It produces a tribunal judgment that is guilt for 18 of the 21 individuals and guilt for 3 of the 6 organizations, but really is a first cut understanding. And the way I would put it is they went in to prosecute the war, and in the course of prosecuting the war, they began to understand the enormity of the Holocaust. And that, of course, is the ongoing project. Jackson had been away from the Supreme Court for a full year. He missed a full term of the Supreme Court. He was AWOL. There were only 8 justices. It didn't sit well with them. And he needed to get back. Colonel Telford Taylor of Jackson's staff was an important part of that first prosecution before the IMT and agreed to sort of head the job. His condition was that they give him a promotion to brigadier general, in part so that he would have command authority with the occupying army. And Taylor, of course, as you've already heard, goes to the podium in late 1946 to begin subsequent proceeding trial number 1, the Doctors Trial. This is an American-only proceeding. The alliance had fractured. Really, the Cold War began in a lot of places, Fulton, Missouri, with Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, and in the Nuremberg courtroom during the IMT trial. And so it's still our U.S. Secretary of Occupation. And what goes forward is the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, digging deeper into the perpetrators of undeniable, horrific, known intentional crimes. This is the Einsatzgruppen extermination soldiers. This is the doctors. This is industrialists. This is the ministries. This is, for a 2.5-year period, what the U.S. has the stomach and the political commitment to continue to hold as an accountability process. This is a glimpse and just one chart of what you've already heard about case 1 of the subsequent proceedings, Karl Brandt, and the medical bureaucracy. This is what the IMT trial and the commitment to do trial allowed us to begin to understand. If we had chosen a different path, it might have been gratifying in its moment and brutal, but of course, firing squads would have not developed any evidence and would have created perpetual debate among historians about what really happened. Instead, we have the knowledge to be here 75 years later and to understand the Holocaust and to teach it and to have its history be undeniable. It's been an honor to be part of this. Google Jackson list if you want to get it. Feel free to email me. I'm on Twitter. And I'm a small part of a permanent responsibility that Jackson, Taylor, Truman, others committed to at Nuremberg, and we are all in their debt. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Sonali Shah, a second-year medical student at New York Medical College, and I will be introducing our next speaker, Robert J. Lifton. Dr. Lifton is a member of the New York Medical College School of Medicine class of 1948 and has been accredited as being a key figure in the establishment of the medical field termed psychohistory. Dr. Lifton has been the recipient of many national awards for his work and has also authored many books as well, including Death and Life, Survivors of Hiroshima, and Witness to an Extreme Century, a memoir. Dr. Lifton declares no conflicts of interest, and now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert J. Lifton.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be part of this symposium at my own medical college, and I'm doubly pleased that Dr. Halperin has helped bring it about. I'm also grateful to the students who have shown so much commitment and helped so much with the organization, particularly Sonali Shah, whom you just heard, who has arranged things with me. When I was beginning my work on Nazi doctors, I spoke to various friends, and some of them had urged me not to undertake the study. Their reasoning was at least twofold. They first said, some of them, why not just condemn evil, leave it alone, don't touch it? That was not convincing to me because I felt we had to not just condemn evil, but probe its sources. There was a second concern they had, that I would inevitably psychologize the behavior of Nazi doctors, somehow attribute it to their childhood or negative life experiences, and in that way neglect the moral dimensions. I took that concern seriously and began with an ethical perspective. So I viewed my work as an exploration of the psychological and historical conditions conducive to evil. Over the course of the work, I also confronted the issue of uniqueness. The Nazis made use of course, ancient anti-Semitic images, but they were unique and modern in their overall organization of the technology of killing. It was even at that time a revolution in the technology of killing. And some believe that given this uniqueness, no other behavior by any group had any relevance to what the Nazis did. And they should only be discussed unto themselves. But my own belief is that the very uniqueness of the killing project, though all too real, included certain features to have parallels in the behaviors of others. And that kind of behavior still being very much present in the world, occurring in our own time and right now. So my remarks for the most part will not be specifically concerned with the Nuremberg trial itself, but with the Nazi legacy and its dangers. And the first issue of legacy is ideology, general ideology and Nazi ideology in particular. Ideology is a combination of a worldview and a set of assumptions, even a theory about how things got to be the way they are and how they could or must be changed. Americans in general tend to underplay ideology. We see ourselves as pragmatic and not prone to ideology the way others are. But of course, everyone has some ideology. And when it moves in a totalistic direction, becomes part of all or none convictions that allow everything, all experiences personally and collectively to be interpreted by that ideology, it becomes part of a movement and is related to a group or a nation or the world. And that totalization of ideology can be profoundly dangerous. Nazi ideology was expressed by Hitler in Mein Kampf in this way. He said, the Nordic race had once been strong and dominant and pure, but had been weakened and infected by the influence of the so-called Jewish race. Jews were a culture-destroying race and had to be removed or killed in order to heal the Nordic race. Sounds crazy to us now, but that's where ideology can take us. In that sense, Nazi ideology could view the mass murder of Jews and also of Slavs and members of various religious groups and homosexuals as part of a therapeutic enterprise. Mass murder was therapeutic. The Nazis spoke of scientific racism, of course, a contradiction in terms, but they actually had what I would call a biomedical vision, a form of biological mysticism. And I heard that expressed by one former Nazi doctor I interviewed who told me that he joined the Nazi Party soon after he heard one of its leaders declare, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. So what is so important about this kind of totalistic ideology is a principle that I've found to be relevant all through my work. It's extremely difficult to kill large numbers of people except with a claim to virtue. Ideology offers that claim to virtue. In this case, one of healing the Nordic race in a way that allegedly benefits all of humankind. A Nazi physician could thus see himself as an idealist, what Nazis called a biological soldier, a cultivator of the genes, a caretaker of the race, and a doctor to that mystical entity known as the folk or the people. And the ideology included a stab in the back mythology in relation to World War I, namely the claim that the German army hadn't actually lost the war, but had been sabotaged, mostly by Jews, also by communist socialists and other traitors. So Hitler became, in this sense, a survivor redeemer. He actually had a vision of leading the German people while he was suffering from the effects of poison gas. It would be tempting, but wrong, I believe, to attribute a psychiatric diagnosis to Hitler as a source of this extreme behavior. He was not psychotic. Actually, a friend and colleague, Fritz Redlich, wrote a careful book about Hitler's illnesses in medical history, and he found that he only suffered from a character disorder. We could call it moral insanity, but that's something different. And that best characterizes this murderous sense of ideological fanaticism. What's important about Nazi ideology is that it turns out right now, with Putin's war in Ukraine, we see an expression of it. Putin has publicly embraced the ideology of the 20th century Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who died in 1954 and who advocated a form of Christian fascism to become part of an expression of an all-encompassing Russian empire. And that empire was not to be subject to what he called disease disintegration. It would include all neighboring areas, including Ukraine, because that disease disintegration would be destructive for that view of a sacred empire. And he spent years in Germany, Ilyin did, and viewed Nazism as a spirit to be absorbed by the Russians, and the Führer as having performed an enormous service for all of Europe, as he put it. When Ilyin died, Putin had his remains repatriated, reburied in Russia, and he also purchased Ilyin's papers from the Michigan State Library where they had been placed. So Ilyin was Putin's man, and he has described himself publicly on several occasions as a follower of him. And when Putin speaks of denazification, he's invoking imagery of an outside invader, even though, as you know, Ukraine has a Jewish president, and the word is bizarre. As with Hitler, Putin isn't psychotic either, but is an ideological fanatic with visionary rage toward the West. He sustained mass killing of Ukrainian civilians, and detachment from his cruelties can again be called a form of moral rather than psychiatric insanity. So we can see how far the ideological fanatical self can propel one into mass murder and evil. You don't have to be mentally ill if you're an ideological fanatic. An important issue here is what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, because it's important to us now today. Gleichschaltung was simply the reorganizing of institutions, so that the Nazis didn't eliminate institutions, rather they subjected them to a reorganizing process. The word Gleichschaltung means coordination or synchronization, or the mechanical idea of shifting gears, and it expresses a vision of absolute unity, of a totalized community. It meant Nazification of all institutions, whether in government, universities, or institutions and professions, and included attacking and removing previous leaders and replacing them with reliable ideologues. One could say that the whole Nuremberg medical trial was essentially about the Nazi Gleichschaltung of the German medical profession. And with that Nazification, there followed policies of extensive sterilization, so-called euthanasia, which I call direct medical killing, and involved actual killing by doctors, often fatal human experiments, and the role of physicians in death camps in selecting Jews for the death chambers, for the gas chambers. And that selection process was no longer illegitimate for the Nazis. The doctors standing at the ramp and sending Jews to the death chambers were just doing their job in what I call the malignant normality of Nazi Germany. And doctors have been guilty of transgressions, not just under the Nazis, but are prone to that partly because we view doctors as gatekeepers to life and death. And they're all too often involved in torture, either directly or in examining victims to see that they're well enough to be tortured, or else in falsifying death certificates as they did in South Africa and other places, or in themselves conducting experiments as the notorious syphilis experiments with Blacks in this country, experiments that are lethal. So we move closer to home here and observe Trumpist visions of versions of Gleichschaltung. Now, Trump is by no means a Nazi. He has no such ideology. In fact, no clear ideology that's consistent at all. But he does seek a form of ownership of reality, as did the Nazis. And he has initiated a considerable focus on changing institutions in major areas, whether justice, State Department, courts, Congress, public health. He has attacked existing people in these institutions, replaced them, humiliated them, and brought in people personally loyal to him and sharing his falsehoods, what I call his solipsistic reality that is responsive only to the needs and inclinations of the individual self. And there have been all too many anti-democratic Americans ready to participate in this version of Trumpist Gleichschaltung. They are often people who have dedicated much of their lives to weakening or destroying the very institutions they're now to head. So our institutions in this process have turned out to be more fragile than we realized and more susceptible to weakening and perverse influence. And in the way that Trump handled or mishandled the COVID pandemic by downplaying it and failing to take measures that would mitigate it, all with the claim to ostensibly opening up society, this had a certain parallel to the Nazi claims of killing to heal. Trump was, in effect, by his policies, killing to heal. But American institutions, in contrast to those in Germany, and this is a source of hope, have a certain tradition of professionalism and truth-telling that could not be entirely eliminated, however undermined and weakened. Something of their independence, at least at times, could manifest itself in criticizing and combating Trumpist Gleichschaltung. And we saw that even with Vice President Pence, who had been so much a toady to Trump, but at the end refused to falsify the election. There are lots of struggles with Trumpist manipulation still in our institutions, and there is a subculture, I would say, of belligerently righteous Trumpists and other right-wingers who attack our democracy and its institutions and express in the process forms of white supremacy that owe much to Nazism. But in these same institutions, there have been groups who have exposed and in some measure stymied seditious Trumpist efforts at reversing the results of a presidential election and carrying out a seizure of power, no less than a coup d'etat, the whole American democratic structure remains profoundly under threat, but pre-existing institutions are still alive, if by no means completely well. Trumpist Gleichschaltung has not been totally successful, though all too harmful. Finally, I want to talk about the Nazi legacy of genocide. Genocidal behavior long predates the Nazis. Raphael Lemkin, who created the word and the concept, based it more on the Turkish genocide of Armenians in 1915. But the Nazis can be seen as having provided a clear model for genocide that can be observed as having operated in such later genocides as those that took place in Cambodia and Rwanda and elsewhere. And according to some observers, at least now in Ukraine, that model includes a perception of a collective national illness, what Kierkegaard called sickness unto death of a whole society, and a totalistic ideological vision of cure, just like Hitler's vision of curing the Nordic race. So genocide becomes explained in terms of sickness and healing. Again, doctors becoming very prominent as gatekeepers of the dead and the living. And doctors were indeed prominent in Turkish genocide and in of Armenians and in many other genocides as well. The Nazi model of genocide includes professional killers and killing professionals. The professional killers are those who are brutalized and whom Heinrich Himmler, the SS leader, praised for their toughness in being able to carry out their killing functions. But the killing professionals include physicians, some of them tried at Nuremberg, and some of them subject to my own study, which I made in the 1970s and 1980s. And here, too, was the destruction of an entire people. And it was again associated with a claim to virtue. There is a national sickness. We provide a national cure by killing. And that perverse idealism is claimed to have benefited the entire world. I want to say something about that Nazi legacy and what I call witnessing professionals. I've used that idea in many aspects of my work of professionals who invoke their special knowledge and experience to expose the destructive behavior of what has become what I call malignant normality. Again, the image of the doctor doing selections in Auschwitz as merely doing his job. And that expression of witnessing professionals could be found in many physician survivors, mostly Jewish, but also German and Polish, who informed us about Nazi evil and devoted their lives to combating Nazi medical killing. And I would give special prominence to Alexander Mitscherlich, an anti-Nazi German physician who attended the Nuremberg medical trial together with his colleague, Fred Mielke, and exposed the culpability of not just a few bad apples, but the entire German medical profession. Mitscherlich was later to reestablish Freudian psychoanalysis in Germany, and together with his wife, Margareta Mitscherlich, wrote important studies of post-war German people in relationship to their having experienced love and loss of a beloved but evil Führer. I was able to write an introduction to an American edition of one of these books called The Inability to Mourn, the title suggesting that this inability contributed to general post-war German political stagnation. The Mitchellisches in their wartime and post-war behavior are true medical psychoanalytic heroes. There are also important witnessing professionals in our own society, and not only in relation to the Nazi legacy, but in continuing to be genuine healers in relation, for instance, to the COVID pandemic, and also in combating climate change and other forms of nuclearization or the embrace of nuclear weapons. This symposium is an expression of witnessing professionals confronting Nazi behavior and Nazi normalization of evil. In becoming doctors, we're often caught up in the social and financial details and in the individual advantages of this specialty or that, but we do well to recover and reanimate the original impulse we had, at least in part, in becoming genuine healers. And that impulse has influenced our choice of profession and has all too often been covered over in our everyday lives. The Nazi legacy contains what is surely the greatest violation of medical responsibility in all of recorded history. But it also reminds us, as physicians, in the most powerful fashion, of our witness to suffering and our commitment to healing. I close with a line of poetry that says this more succinctly and in a way that has haunted me throughout my work. I have in mind a line by the great American poet Theodore Rutger, who wrote quite simply, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lifton. My name is Harley Weber. I'm a second-year med student as well, and I'm here to introduce our next and final speaker, Mr. Boaz Nagar. Mr. Nagar will be sharing the story from one of the prison guards of Adolf Eichmann. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Nagar, who also has no conflicts of interest.
Good afternoon, everyone here. Thank you for letting me speak here tonight or this afternoon. We commemorate today the tragedy that happened to our people more than 80 years ago during World War II. We heard about a lot of stuff here about the doctors and Nuremberg, but rather than me telling a story about the Holocaust or doctors, I will tell you about a different aspect and consequences of the Holocaust. The man that I'm going to introduce you today has nothing to do with the war in Europe, nor with the tragedy that occurred there, but he made a significant contribution to the justice that came after it. Khamer is a small village in the district of Sana'a in Yemen, is where it all began. A new baby born to the Nagar family on December 26, 1934, his name Shalom, which means in Hebrew, peace. His first 8 years of life was beautiful, with his 2 brothers and 2 sisters in a very humble house. His tragedy began when in 1942, he lost his father. Just to remind you that in 1942, it was the year of the Venice Conference in Berlin, which coordinated the activities of the various institutions and summarized the details of the implementations of the final solution to the question of the Jewish on Europe, and of which Eichmann had been involved in this preparation, a program initiated by Adolf Hitler. As being an orphan Jew was not a desirable thing in Yemen, the government would take the children and convert them to Islam. Therefore, the first thing to do is for the mother to get married. Indeed, she got married. The husband, except the two sisters and the little brother who just turned 4 or 5, but Shalom and his older brother, Yechiel, was away. Shalom's old brother was left to look after the father's house, and Shalom lived with him for a while. The condition of living in Yemen for 2 boys, 8 years old and 11 years old by themselves, are hard to imagine. After a while, Shalom decided he could not longer stay there and would start his journey searching for relatives in the capital city, Sana'a. You must understand that the distance between Khamer and Sana'a is approximately 100 kilometers or 63 miles. And you can imagine a 8 years boy walking to Sana'a. So that's this distance. I will not feed you with all the details of how he reached Sana'a, but I can tell you that besides finding food and water and warming himself in the nights, he needed to deal with the wild animal, thieves, etc. on the way there. During the night, he would dig a hole in the ground and sleep there, covering his body with the dirt to keep warm. That was his life then. There was a voice saying that the Mashiach was almost here and that we needed to go to Eretz Israel. It was 1948 when the first wave of Yemenite Jews were brought Israel under the magic carpet operation. Miraculously, Shalom found his brother and sister, and together they began their journey toward the Yemenite camp where all the Jews were gathered to go to Israel. At the age of 15, Shalom arrived to Israel. After finding his uncle, he lived with them, but not for a long time. The army knocked on the door one day, searching for his uncle's son who had passed away, but somehow been registered with the army. Shalom was still young for the army, but he was thinking that this good opportunity to have a place that can feed you, give you clothes, a warm bed, and etc. As there was no one in the house, Shalom said, "I'm the boy," and they took him to the army. He has been in the army and security service for all his working life. In 1960, Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina and brought to Israel. To guard him in the prison, a special unit was formed, and one of its members was Shalom. Following the instruction of the guard, one guard will be with Eichmann in the cell. The second guard will guard them in a different room, and there will be a third guard that guard both of them. All this will prevent that first, nobody can catch Eichmann, and second, that Eichmann will not make any suicide before the trial. Shalom's jobs was to guard Eichmann even when he used the toilet, bringing him food and testing it before him to ensure no one poison was added to it. Almost 6 months he guarded him from December 15, 1961 till May 34, 1962. Shalom learned of the Holocaust during that time, and he began to develop a fear for the animal he was guarding. When it came time to execution, Shalom said that everyone wanted to do it beside him. He didn't want to make the execution. He did not want it. Therefore, they had the lottery, and guess who won? Shalom. He became in the lottery. His commander told him that the commander told him that this is his destiny and he must do it. "We will pick you up when the execution takes place," Now you can go home to your family, the commander told me. On May 31, 1962, Shalom, his wife, and his first child were walking on the street in Cologne when a police car stopped and asked Shalom to come with them. It was the time. Shalom arrived in a jail in Ramla and prepared for the execution. He put the rope on Eichmann's neck. He went to the room when there was a button to press, and when he pressed it, doors under Eichmann's legs were open and he fell to his death. Shalom thought that he finished, but he was not. His commander told him, you start, you need to finish. Release the body from the rope and take him to the oven. While Shalom had no experience hanging, he didn't know there was pressure in the body. So when he stood in front of the body to release the rope, the body released the pressure through the mouth and made a sound that left Shalom shocked. Somehow, he held the body, but put it in a stretcher or wheel bed and brought it to the oven, not mention that he almost fell the body the way there. From this point, his commander looked at him. He was a very bad condition. And he told him, that is we would take you, that's it. We will take you home. 1 year after the execution, Shalom was sick. He was sick. He couldn't go out from the house. He was afraid from every movement that happened in outside. Also, when he used to go out and his wife used to mention Eichmann, he was running back home. He was so afraid there was tragedy for him. For 30 or 35 years, it was kept secret. During that time, Shalom became more religious and enrolled in rabbinic program. He also received a shochet title. After his story was released to the public, many TV channels wanted to interview him. One of them was a German television channel. Shalom agreed to interview, and they came with their equipment to his house in Holon, Israel. Shalom approached them during the preparation for the interview and said, I'm willing to interview, but I want to decide what should take place. Okay, what room? He said, no, not here. You must come with me. Shalom took them to the Kollel, where it's a place when you are learning Torah. When he was regularly learning in Holon, took a chair on a stander, located to the Aron Kodesh, and all the books sit behind him. And he said, now you can start. The interview took place. At the end, they asked him about the reason why he decided here. And he answered, you are German television, and I know that many Germans will see it. So I have a message for them. Look, we are still here without Torah and the Talmud and the Mishnah and our tradition. We are growing and still kicking. Am Israel Chai. That is Reb Shalom Nagar, the humble, kind Ish Chesed that never does no harm to no one and is a role model to me, my father. Thank you very much.
So we're now at the portion of the program where Dr. Halpern is going to lead the questions and answers. So we have lots of questions in the chat currently. You can, I'm sorry, the Q&A. Feel free to enter further questions into the Q&A, although I think we probably have plenty to cover already. And those in the auditorium can use the microphones. So thank you, Dr. Halpern.
Thank you, Murray. Have a microphone. My name is Edward Halpern. I'm the Chancellor and CEO of New York Medical College, the Provost for Biomedical Affairs of Touro University. I want to welcome those attending online. I have received messages from as far afield as Croatia and Italy telling me that they are participating in the program, and I want to thank those in the audience. If anyone wishes philanthropically to support this program or those like it, for those in the auditorium, Mr. Jerry Volk is waving and standing up. And for those who wish to email him, jvolk@nymc.edu. The question and answer box is filled with writing. And as those of us in academics have learned, some of them are actually questions for our panelists. Our first question is for Dr. Robert J. Lifton. If Dr. Lifton could put his video on and unmute.
The video's
Dr.
not
Lifton,
going.
I don't see you. Are you there?
I am, but the
Oh,
video
there you
doesn't
are.
seem,
Dr.
okay, here I
Lifton,
am, yes. Okay,
Dr. Lifton, our questioner would like your thoughts, please, as a physician, on the issue of diseases named in honor of physicians and scientists who were allied with Nazism, such as Wegener's granulomatosis or Van Hallevorden's Spates disease. There are many such examples. What is your view about unnaming such diseases named after scientists and physicians who worked with concentration camp specimens, please?
my own position would be to unname them. The honor of having one's name next to a condition of suffering which one has relieved is not appropriate for a Nazi doctor who has violated his Hippocratic oath and much worse. The alternative would be to allow the name to continue and to each time it was used, make clear that this same doctor was involved in lethal activities, but that would be difficult to do. So I would favor the unnaming for that reason. And I would favor that the exact reason and the sequence be explained to bring out the fact that previously talented doctors really, in some cases, not most of them, but in some cases in the forefront of their field, had participated in lethal experiments, and that point should be made.
Thank you, Dr. Lifton. Professor Barrett and Professor Annas, we have several questions for you. Let's begin with the concept of either having an ongoing Nuremberg-like court system or recreating one. Our questioner wants to know, how would you avoid repeating history? You described, Professor Barrett, the Soviets almost leaving the discussions to create the tribunal, Jackson working as a diplomat. Our questioner would like to know from the two of you, how would you create such a, quote, apolitical, close quote, system for war crimes trials at this point in our history? Perhaps we'll take this in alphabetical order. Professor Annas first, Professor Barrett second. I think that's a great question. Obviously, creating the tribunal itself is a political act, and it requires the basic agreement. I think Taylor is right, that you not resort to aggressive war, that you try to take that, and that's the main crime in the tribunal. The question is not so much, is it political? A lot of it's going to be political, but is there an alternative? Is there any other possible way forward to make war crimes a real crime? That if it's committed, it will be sanctioned. And with that, the hope that that would at least foreclose some wars, although we seem to like wars a lot.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't find the Ukraine tolerable. I'm sure Professor Barrett doesn't either.
Right. No, we're in agreement, I think, all the way down the line. And I also agree with the questioner. This is an ideal, maybe a utopian structure, but law enforcement always is. 1945 was a special moment of unity. There'd been a world war, if you will, and the world had won. The Nazis and Germany had unconditionally surrendered. There was total power, total occupation, and they decided to use that power together. And this is the Russians agreeing mostly to play by a Western legal system to do the Nuremberg IMT process. And the Americans then did what they did in the subsequent proceedings. That kind of position of power and decision to elevate certain values, better ones over inferior ones or evil ones, is a unique accomplishment. And I don't have any illusion that it's automatic, that it's easy, but it is sometimes possible. And as George just said, what's the alternative but to try? The Yugoslavia Tribunal was, in the 1990s, a global consensus response to a war on the European continent and visible atrocities. The Rwanda Tribunal was a response through global consensus. Many countries of the world have created the ICC, but of course the superpowers are not part of that. But I think it's, it's like the law enforcement in Westchester County or New York City or the United States. We try with the power we've got and the values we've got to do it better. If a runaway, perversion of law captures an international tribunal, we are a superpower and we can quit. That's certainly a down the road, and I hope not to be used option, but to not try and not participate on the front end just seems to be not using one tool that could be productive.
Let's stay with that thought. We have some questions here, which we will open to all of you on the panel. The questioners are looking for you to make a distinction between an act of war and a war crime. Several of you raised the issue of the Ukraine. When does something occur which is not a consequence of war, but constitutes a crime potentially to be tried?
Well, I think there are maybe four categories to think about. The first is aggression, is making war, starting war. That is the Russian situation, that was the Nazi situation. The second is commission of international law violations in the conduct of war. Think of shooting a surrendering soldier from the other side or torturing a prisoner of war. Those are Hague Convention, Geneva Convention violations. A third category is crimes against humanity, Geneva Convention violations, genocide. It's not necessarily war or army on army, but it is crimes against civilians that breach moral and positive law norms. And a fourth category would be particular prescribed kinds of conduct that are just forsworn as a special matter. For example, the use of chemical and biological weapons. Whether offensive or defensive, there are international law commitments to forswear certain things. And so any of those things could be a topic for investigation and, with jurisdiction and power in a tribunal setting, prosecution.
I'm both listening to you and watching people type in real time, and someone is typing in, we're going to lateral the ball to Professor Anas. Could you ever envision the United Nations as currently structured taking on the task of creating a war crimes tribunal to objectively deal with the Ukraine situation?
No, unfortunately. First, have to reform the UN. It's a big problem. We have to get rid of the veto power in the Security Council, for example, and probably try to redo the General Assembly as well, to be more representative from populations.
Thank you, Dr. Lifton or Ms. Lurie. Anything you'd like to add on this issue? Dr. Lifton, you're on mute.
No, I'm not.
Hold on, Dr. Lifton. We can see your lips moving, but we can't hear you. Let us do some technical wizardry at this.
Now, how's that? Can you
Okay,
hear me
we're in
now?
business. Yes.
Okay, it's strange to us that there are international laws about the conduct of war. After all, war is about killing. Yet there are such laws that limit war making to the killing of soldiers on the opposite side of the war. That itself is an oddity in a way, and it has to be noted. I would say that in all wars, there are crimes of war. There's a certain situation in all wars that leads to the killing of civilians or the torturing of enemy soldiers or anyone else. But there are certain wars in which there exists what I call an atrocity-producing situation. And what I mean by that is a set of arrangements that are both military policies that are aggressive in shooting quite quickly, and the psychology of the soldiers who lose buddies, become aggrieved and angry and confused, and can actually, as they did at My Lai, kneel and shoot their guns as though they were in combat, because they have a momentary illusion of engaging an enemy who had been stalking them and invisible. So situations of atrocity-producing situations produce a very large number of atrocities, and we've been party to that in Vietnam, in Iraq, and yes, in Afghanistan as well. And very much now, the Russians are part of it in Putin's war in Ukraine. So I think that's another way of looking at it.
I just, if I could say one thing, Dr. Lifton, I just want to say I found your concept of an atrocity-producing situation very fruitful and right on target. And Vietnam's a perfect example where you decided to decide who's winning based on the body count, how many people you kill. And it didn't really even matter if they're carrying guns or not. As long as you killed a Vietnamese person, that counted. And you were fulfilling your mission, which is really sick.
Yeah, thank you. I agree.
We're going to need, please, to put a microphone on Mr. Nagar. We have a very long list of questions for him. So please. Perhaps, Mr. Nagar, would it be best if he sat at the table? Let's use one of the large microphones for him. Do we have Mr. Nagar on camera? Very good. Sir, we have a lot of people who've written in with questions about your father, please. First, did your father ever perceive that his life was in danger, or that you and your siblings' life were in danger from a Hitler sympathizer, neo-Nazi who would come looking for him or your family to try to wreak revenge on you?
Well, and generally living in Israel, everybody would feel in those times, everyone was feeling safe. They never feel any danger for nobody.
Closer to the microphone, please.
They never feel any danger for nobody. But I can tell you, because it kept secret for 30, 35 years, nobody know about it. It just start the 80s. So from the 80s, most of the Nazis, most of the organizations, I believe, the Secret Service in Israel knew about them and was taking care of that. I don't think, we never felt any fear.
Another questioner wishes to know, were there times when your father expressed regret that he had been called upon to do this, that he wished a different road had been taken in his life?
My father always didn't want to do that. He didn't want to kill nobody. He cannot kill even a mosquito. He's a person that always dedicated, is a spiritual, living his children. He was forced to do that, but well, he did that because he became in the lottery. But he was the only one that didn't want to do that. Beside that, I can tell you a story. He was the director of the jail for terrorists in Israel in Hebron, and he used to have a lot of Arab terrorists there, and he always kept them very well. He kept them he always treat them like a human being. He's kind of person that never. He told me once that if it didn't happen, it was better for him because he was sick from that. He was sick from that. There's a reason why, but I don't want to talk about this why.
If members of the audience here in Valhalla have questions, please go to the microphones on either side, because we're going to have to be sure that people can hear you. While someone is going to the microphone, we have a question for Margot Lurie. The questioner wishes to know, what have you learned from this process of preparing these remarks in the symposium that you think will affect you as a physician insofar as you're currently a medical student?
So we actually have a course here at New York Medical College taught by Dr. Halperin that addresses some of these points, including Nazi pseudoscience experiments. And it was a really impactful course. It's taught in the first year. And so that course, along with preparing these remarks, it's every time I read it, read something, read a document and look back on history, it's it kind of is just like the shock all over again from the first time. It's hard to find words, I guess, to say, but it's something that I really think that is important in medical education. And I'm really grateful that we have a course at NYMC about it. I think that's really important in all medical education.
Thank you, Ms. Lurie. Let's go to questions here in the auditorium. Let's go from my left to my right. Sir, please come to the microphone and state your name and state who the question is addressed to, please.
Can you hear me? My name is Jonathan. I actually introduced Professor Nas, and I have a question for him and any of the panelists in general. Professor Nas, you mentioned a story with Dr. J. Katz, I think, of how the relationship between a patient and a doctor under the guise of research might not necessarily be to heal. Do you see any extrapolation of holding doctors accountable in the Nuremberg trial to holding doctors accountable in general, in particular in instances such as research?
Okay, it's really, really hard to hold doctors accountable. I know doctors accountable think they get sued all the time, but they actually don't. It's one reason we set up this system of research regulations in the United States, with the thought that maybe if they had to go through a review board and had to get written informed consent, it might make it less likely that doctors would exceed their boundaries of what they're doing. Jay Katz always used to ask this question. He used to say, how much pain and suffering can you inflict on a patient, on a person, a subject in this case, for medical progress? And I mean, he wouldn't say none, but he would say, you have to really, really have a good justification for inflicting pain and suffering on a person. And medical progress itself is not enough. That's one reason informed consent was kind of invented, is that we know it's not enough. And even we know, even with consent, it's not enough. All right. We can ask questions about the recent pig heart experiment, for example. That was hailed as a giant step forward in medical progress. Maybe it is, maybe it will be.
I have a tendency to doubt that, but what I really wonder about is what the person who got the pig heart thought was happening. We know that he said, "I'd prefer a human heart," but there's doctors told him it's not available for you. And one reason was he was a bad patient. He didn't follow doctor's orders. We could just talk about that a lot. I don't think anybody should go to jail for that, but I do think that that's really running on the line. I don't know if that helped answer your question or if I missed your question, but you can follow it up if I didn't answer it.
Maybe I could say something to that as well. My whole career, I've done almost exclusively research. Most of the people I've done research with, I had friendly feelings toward. They could be people who've been put through Chinese thought reform, or even Vietnam veterans who had turned against the war, or others for whom I felt sympathy. And my method was always interviews. And in those interviews, I felt I had, partly as a physician, but just as a human being, a certain responsibility to them to be in some measure therapeutic, even though that was not my task. They were not my patients. I didn't have a responsibility to curing them, but I did have in my own mind a responsibility to put forward a healing spirit with them. When it came to interviewing Nazi doctors, that was something else. I no longer felt at all sympathetic, and the whole atmosphere in the interview was more tense because they understood that I was trying to get underneath their rationale and get details and motivations for their malignant behavior. And oddly enough, since I don't really know German, the translator, although I'd rather have had fluent German, which I didn't, but the translator being, interpreter being present was a help, was a kind of buffer between us in the back and forth process. I was very aware of it because it was in such contrast to the interviews where I had felt a commitment to a healing spirit. On the other hand, my also being a doctor meant something, because here were two doctors facing each other, one interviewing at least indirectly, accusingly, but never exploding and saying, "You're a killer," or anything like that. That wasn't my task. He could tell, though, by the pressure of my questions, which I had prepared, that there was an accusatory element in what I was asking him. And in any case, I could prepare myself for that by learning as much as possible about what he had done, because we're not necessarily very good as psychiatrists or doctors at really recognizing lies. And he could tell that I wasn't accepting his sense of himself as just an ordinary conservative person who got into a bad situation and tried to do as well as he could. That was the way they tried to present themselves to me. So all that came into play during my efforts at being a responsible research doctor. And
Thank
I'm
you,
sure
Dr.
that I fell short
We
on
will
many occasions. But
give
that's
you
what
the
I tried
last
to do.
question on my right here in the auditorium. Please,
Thank you
your
so
name
much.
and your question to whom it's
Okay,
directed.
my name is Karen Friedman. I'm a PhD historian teaching Holocaust history and one of the
I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to put the microphone closer to your
Okay.
mouth. People are having trouble hearing.
Can people hear me now better? Yes.
Yeah.
Great. And my question, first of all, this has been fantastic. And as a teacher, the documentary evidence from trials, there's nothing surpassing that. But my question to you is still the Nuremberg trials and the doctor's trial was only of the 14 top medical professions. And I understand that the prosecutors went after, this was not a witch hunt, the most documented witnesses and evidence. But I'm wondering about people like Hans Suhring, who then became the World Medical Association in 1992, who also, he wasn't ever prosecuted, but there was quite a lot of evidence that he participated in the euthanasia of several hundred little Catholic kids who were, they don't use the word disabled anymore, but fell under one of the categories. How do we look at the people, the thousands and thousands of doctors who, and nurses? There was a trial in 1965, the nurses trial, where interesting enough, 14 nurses were also tried because they also carried out doctors' orders. My point is, what is the best way to look at the thousands and thousands of people who escape justice simply because there's not enough time and effort to go after them? Do anybody have, an idea on the best approach on that?
Thank you. I suppose we could call this the version of the tip of the iceberg question that many are probably guilty, but only some are brought before the bar of justice. Professor Barrett, do you want to take a shot at it for us, please?
It's an inevitable problem. I think across any category of criminal activity, some perpetrators get away with it. Legal systems do better when they are robust and have the capacity to investigate, identify, and pursue the most culpable, because then they become institutions that teach and deter. And so down the road, there's less perpetration. But I don't think there's anything approaching 100% accountability process. There are murderers here in New York State who are getting away with it, et cetera. And that is just a very tragic thing, but I'm afraid an inevitable thing.
Thank you. Our time period for questions has flown by. I want to thank our panelists. I would be remiss if I did not welcome our guests here at New York Medical College from the Lander College for Women in Manhattan. Welcome to New York Medical College. I wish to invite to the podium the archivist of the college, Mr. Nicholas Webb.
Thank you, Dr. Halperin. My name is Nicholas Webb, and I'm the college archivist and curator of historical collections in the Health Sciences Library. Before introducing our final speaker, I wanted to briefly invite those of you who are here today in person to view the exhibit on display outside the auditorium of material from the collections of the Health Sciences Library and of placards honoring the faculty and alumni at New York Medical College who were emigres or survivors of the Holocaust. For those of you who could not be here in person today, this exhibit will be on display for the next several months in the exhibit case of the Health Sciences Library, and I invite you all to take a look. And finally, before our next speaker begins his remarks, I'd just like to remind you that when you're asked to stand, please avoid stepping in front of the camera so that our remote viewers are not blocked. And would now like to introduce Rabbi Moshe Krupka, who is the Executive Vice President and University Ombudsman of the Touro University System. He is the Chief Liaison for Community Affairs and the former National Executive Director of the Orthodox Union, to deliver some closing remarks.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome to everybody. I recognize the hour. After what has been a spectacular program, I'm left speechless and numb from the array of presentations. I must tell you how so proud I am to be part of Touro University and New York Medical College, a medical and health sciences campus, an educational institution which holds programs like this each and every Yom HaShoah. As I said earlier to another group, if we're not going to do this, then who will? Our thanks again to our Chancellor, Dr. Edward Halpern, and NYMC Director, Health Sciences Library, Marie Asher, for not only living up to the mission of our institution, but also for instilling within it the ruach, the spirit of remembrance, of justice, and of conscience. Thank you again as well to NYMC board member Joseph Popak and his family for endowing the Miriam Popak Chair in Biomedical Ethics and the Holocaust for their support of such programs. There's so much to comment on, the science, the justice, the medicine, so many macro subjects to discuss. With your permission, I'd like to briefly bring this down to the micro level, down to the individual. 6 million for me is just a very large number. So as I've done in past years, I have focused on individuals who survived the Shoah, or during recent history, people who have demonstrated courage and leadership in the face of the most terrible adversity. And this year, I'd like to share with you the story of Dr. Ada Bimko. Dr. Bimko was a Jewish dentist who worked in Poland when the Nazis came and rounded up the Jews. When she arrived at Auschwitz, she watched as the men and women were divided and then most sent to the gas chambers. Among those that were taken were her parents, her husband, and her 6-year-old child. Because of her medical training, Ada Bimko was spared the gas chambers and instead assigned to the infirmary. There, in a primitive facility, she was credited with saving the lives of many women inmates by performing rudimentary surgeries and sending them out of the infirmary in advance of selection for the gas chambers. After 15 months in Auschwitz, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen, where she literally kept 149 Jewish children alive through the brutal winter of 1945. Following liberation, the British appointed Dr. Bimko to organize and head a team of doctors and volunteers from among the healthier inmates to work alongside the British military medical team in an effort to try and save as many critically ill and injured survivors as possible. Dr. Bimko was a victim. She was a captive in the concentration camps, a captive whose dearest family members had been murdered. But she reached down deep and found the strength to peel away at the pain, to peel away at the adversity, the ability to look beyond the cruelty that she had experienced because there were still others who needed help. Dr. Bimko understood that this is the mission of mankind, to help others. I can genuinely say that the leadership and the faculty of New York Medical College and TU University understand this mission. And it's not that it simply understands it. You see, the Hebrew language has different words for knowledge, different levels, if you will, of knowledge. The word chachma means wisdom, and bina means understanding. Bina is the use of chachma to understand something. But the highest level of knowledge is das. It is the acquired idea that one has come to understand through both chachma and bina. If you will, das is an understanding that is baked into your DNA. New York Medical College is about das, about an understanding that is embedded in our DNA as an institution. We are so proud to be able to sponsor programs like this. On this, the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg Physicians Trial, we are proud to proclaim that we will continue to train physicians and health professionals to not only understand the science of medicine, but also to inject that training with a reverence for life to infuse clinical education with morality, a devotion to ethics, and a sincere caring for others. That is who we are, and that is what our institution stands for. As a first-generation survivor, my mother of blessed memory at the age of 14 saw her father and her brothers slaughtered before her eyes. As her son, I can assure you that there is no greater satisfaction, no greater response to the cruelty and inhumanity that occurred during the Shoah than being associated with an institution that works to perpetuate the values of serving the underserved, standing up for morality and ethics, and training the next generation of leaders. We thank each and every one of you for joining us in this sacred undertaking. We will recite the prayer for the martyred souls of the Shoah. For those that are in the auditorium, it's suggested that you stand in respect. And I invite each and every one of you, as the prayer will be intoned both first in Hebrew and then in English, to have in mind those particular martyrs who were taken from us during this cruel and barbaric time in history and in Jewish history. El Moli Rachamim, Shochein Bam Romim, Hamtzei Menucha Nuchono Al Kanfei Hashchina, B'malos Kedoshim Utahorim, Kizora Harukia Masirim, Es Nishmos, HaKedoshim V'Atorim, Shehumsu V'Shenergu, V'Shenishchetu V'Shenisrufu, V'Shenitba'u, V'Shenechniku Al Kiddush Hashem, Al Yidei Hatzorim Hanatzim V'Ozreihem, Yemach Shemam V'Zichram. Bavur Shebli Nedetin Stok Bi'aras Karas Nishmoseihem, Bigan Eden Teheim V'Nuchasam, L'chein Balarachamim Yastirein B'Seisek Nafav Li'olamim, V'Yitzro B'Tzor Achayim Es Nishmoseihem, Adonai Hu Nachalosam, V'Yenuchu B'Shalom Al Mishkavoseihem, V'Nomar Amen. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence, in the lofty levels of the holy and the pure ones, for the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, strangled, in the sanctification of your name, through the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. May their name and memory be obliterated. Because this community will continue to remember, will donate charity, and to do our best to ensure that this will never occur again, in remembrance of their souls. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity. And may he bind their souls in the bond of life. The Almighty is their heritage, and may they repose in peace on their resting place. And let us all say, Amen. Thank you for joining with us this evening.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for attending. Thanks to everyone who was available online. And thank you to all of our speakers, to the planning committee, and to everyone involved. I have brought up the CE slide one final time for those of you who need the information. Thank you very much and good night.